Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the event on the pathways and lessons learned leading to a just transition work program. We are very privileged to have for this session distinguished delegates and senior officials that will give us a framing about just transition. And I must say that this is happening at a very timely moment where the COP has entered the political stage, in particular with respect to the work program on just transition. We have a number of speakers that I will introduce as they take the floor, and we would hopefully have the moment for exchange, including also in terms of what this group would see as useful inputs in the work that parties and non-party stakeholders are doing now to advance the discussions on the Just Transition Work Program. So I first would like to recognize the Honorable Minister Zakia Khattabi, Minister of Climate, the Environment, Sustainable Development and Green Deal from Belgium, who is also assuming currently, who will be taking over the presidency of the European Council in January. Honorable Minister, we're very privileged to have you with us. So merci beaucoup. And then we are expecting Ms. Barbara Creasy, Minister of Forestry and Fisheries and Environment Affairs, Republic of South Africa. But as we know, this is the political moment at the COP. Ministers are always in difficult situations to join events. But without further ado, I would like to turn to my colleague and our senior official here, Ms. Fatima Denton, who is director at the United Nations University, the Institute for Natural Resources in Africa, to help us start with the framing of our discussion. Dr. Denton, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you very much. There's plenty to say, so I'm going to try and get through these slides as quickly as possible. Let me sort of start by saying that the transition to low-carbon development is part of those conversations that are quite contested, because what is justice to one party may be injustice to another party. So just transition in itself is a very relative set of words. That said, we obviously need to arrive at a situation where we have a well-defined trajectory and where different stakeholders can recognize themselves within that pathway. Just transition is in itself, as I mentioned, quite contested, but it also has its genealogy within the US Labour government. So it's not a set of conditions or terminology, as I mentioned before, that is recognized by a good part of the, at least global South. In terms of Africa, a lot of the policymakers that we talk to often start by asking questions like, what is just transition? What justice are we talking about? Whose justice are we talking about? And how do we enable the transition? So these are very often key questions that are often asked in terms of what just transition is about. I think the question of just transition is also one whereby we are talking about essentially climate externalities. And we're talking about climate externalities that are borne by a good part of people in the developing world. And so we have to also recognize that the past harms do not equal climate emissions. We also need to recognize that the big polluters are often the least impacted, because most of the people who are going to have to bear the brunt are people who do not have the capacity to fix the problem. So that's a big it's a big problem. The market costs are inflated because we are increasingly talking about market as the main solution, and we also realize that the social cost in terms of decarbonizing are often not seen. So there's a general misrecognition or invisibility related to the social cost, where we are not factoring into our transition pathways some of the very important social cost. We're also moving away from an economic system because we recognize that the current system that we have in place is not fit for purpose. And that current system in itself has problems. It's a system that is very much prone to competition. And yet we are somewhat unwilling to make the changes related to the current economic system that we have. We talk about transitions, but what we actually do need is a transformation, because the systemic changes are so big that maybe transition in itself might be not enough. And then also to just mention that the environmental stewards are basically forced to remodel and rethink a new ecological system. Many of the poorer communities in different parts of the developing world are not to be blamed for a situation that they find themselves in. But these are the people that would have to think out of what is currently happening and think through a new ecological system that would be able to enable us to get to just transition. So the just transition, I often tend to say that, you know, it's hardwired in all kinds of injustices, from governance to finance to institutional infrastructure, and not to mention also some of the other structural problems that are there. So it's really is a difficult conversation, as I said before, because there are so many injustices that are superimposed on the structural problems. In the case of Africa, I mean, this is already well known, but it's a continent that only you know, is can account for 40% of the global emissions. So that's is an enviable position that I think many of the developed world would like to be. 30 African countries own fewer than half of the household in terms of access to electricity. And also the very levers of the transition that we want to displace are the things that most of the countries depend on. Countries in Africa, in terms of their reserve to production ratio, in terms of their oil and gas, have about 41 years in terms of energy production, but they might have to face stranded assets. And these are the resources that we have to displace if we want to stay within our temperature guardrail of 2 degrees or 1.5. It's also important to say that COVID-19 has created a lot of difficulties for many countries. We've seen a decline in terms of GDP, a lot of economic losses, supply chain disruptions. And this is also going to be problematic for many of the countries because the resources that they need to enable the transition are simply not there. And very often a number of these countries are saddled with debt. So it makes it really difficult, and they might have to even go back and borrow from the very people that have, you know, they're lending money to from. So it's a complicated situation. If you take into account the unsustainable debt levels, the debt stress, coupled with also the energy anxiety as a result of the situation. And the fact that we all find ourselves in a current economic situation that is causing a lot of inflationary pressures, but also difficult across the globe, but probably more so in countries in Africa that have a very high debt burden and high interest rates as well, in terms of their necessity to service their debts. So I won't go into all of this, but these are some of the problems that we see. The reason why it is such an urgent issue is because there is extreme poverty in the parts of the world that are very much in need of an equitable transition, a fair transition. There is also a lot of unemployment. 34% million people, as I should say, were unemployed in 2019. There is high energy poverty, as we know. Over 640 million people in Africa do not have access to clean cooking. There are problems with fiscal pressures, as we know as well, because a lot of these resources are resources that are also supporting African economies in terms of export revenue. A country like Nigeria is reliant on its oil and gas sector, about 80 to 90% of its export revenue. And this is also causing a lot of macroeconomic pressures. We've had 3 reports, the United Nations University, very quickly to say that some of these reports, the first one was looking at stranded assets and asking ourselves whether Africa is at that crossroad where it needs to really assess its resources in the light of stranded assets. And we did it mainly to create an alert and to say to African policymakers that this is coming your way, and that you need to have to start thinking about what you're going to do about your resources, because these resources will get stranded. This current report, we had another second one. The second one was basically also looking at stranded asset, but also talking about the issue of sovereign risk, and basically addressing that in the face of just transition. This third report will be coming out very soon. It's looking at stranded asset, but the economics of stranded assets. And some of the findings I want to talk about today are going to be in this report. Some of these I've mentioned already in terms of GDP. Basically 8% decline in GDP per capita in countries, mainly because of the COVID-19 situation, which left a lot of economies badly bruised. The amount of monies that Africa needs, about 1.3 trillion annually, to make good on the finance and its adaptation and mitigation needs. I think that's also a big problem for the continent. The debt issues I've talked about, so I wouldn't go too much into details, but just to say that the risk of stranded assets are quite real. We will see about 65% decline, I think, as I mentioned, in terms of net revenue from oil and gas. Obviously, this would have an impact also in terms of the workforce, job losses. I think the main problem is many countries in Africa do realize the need for a transition. What they're trying to work out is what do they do in the short term, and how do they work themselves out of the current scenario. Even though a number of countries are doing quite a lot in terms of mitigation and exploring options to keep their economy to a low carbon development, but there are still huge factors that will affect this transition. I think in that report, and in this one also talking about 206.5 trillion cubic feet in terms of gas that are at the risk of getting stranded. So that's quite a lot. And in a sector where these resources are also supporting social protection. We've seen that in countries like Ghana, a lot of the revenue from oil and gas is supporting education, senior high school education. In countries like Angola, they're using it in the health sector. So what do you do with that sort of social protection layer when these resources are not there anymore? And the mining industry is also very much linked to the banking sector as well. So when the mining industry is under duress and under stress, that also has an impact on currency, and the currencies tend to depreciate as well. Obviously, climate finance is a big problem because a lot of the big push that the continent needs can only be enabled with climate finance. 213.4 billion a year is what's needed in terms of annual climate financing gap. So we're well under the required needs that we have. Capacity and knowledge needs are there as well. Some of the countries that are under study in our report, like South Africa, are already doing quite a lot with JETPs, but these are also a basket of problems as well, because there's a lot of borrowing of initial monies that are needed for the JETPs, and it also then means that countries find themselves in debt. We could become quite complacent with the structural problems if we want to stay in those, and they are big, but we are also seeing that there is a lot of opportunities. There are opportunities in terms of green minerals. One of our studies we did was talking about how 42 out of the 62 critical green minerals are found in Africa. And these minerals can be a catalyst to the fourth industrial revolution. So this is already providing new markets for countries in Africa, and the resources from tantalum to cobalt in Morocco to platinum in South Africa. And also the fact that as we see with the Ukrainian-Russian war, with the problem of oil and gas, basically, European countries are looking to Africa to source their new energy needs. There's also the potential of green hydrogen in Namibia, for instance, and that could also be home to some of the hydrogen that the world needs. So Africa does have the resources that the world needs, and this could be new markets for the continent in terms of expanding energy access, but also new investment opportunities. The renewable energy transition can be able by the green minerals also, because to be able to get there, we need more of these green minerals. But it's also important to note that climate finance is a huge problem in terms of enabling that transition, especially in terms of renewable energy. There are problems related to battery storage, and also the upfront investment is very often a problem for many countries in Africa. There are also problems related to societies being displaced in terms of renewable energy projects. Some examples related to places like Kenya, where wind power plants, etc., could also result in the displacement of people. And then when you displace people, you rob them of their ancestral lands, but also some of their identities, and culture also gets lost. Natural gas is becoming an important part of the storyline, but obviously there is a double speak, because European countries are more or less saying that natural gas is not all that clean, but as we saw with the the Russian war and Ukrainian war, many European countries were also looking to secure supplies in natural gas, when previously the talk had been that Africa should basically leave its resources in the ground. And the argument for Africa is that if it needs to industrialize, especially green industrialization, it needs to tap into its natural gas, at least as a start, to catalyze the transition that it needs. Some of the policy recommendations that we have in our study is an overnight transition is not possible for Africa. It must probably even take a dual track, whereby it is exploiting its resources, but at the same time preparing itself for low carbon development. We mentioned the critical minerals, that's an investment opportunities. The fact also that Africa's energy poverty is so acute, some of the resources that it has could actually be a market to develop and to expand on its energy security and energy access. Probably also important to say how we get there would be important in terms of coordination, because we can't get there in a disorderly way. So the sectors that would need to position themselves, need to be properly coordinated, and the investment opportunities would have to make sense. Africa is often seen as a risky venture for most investors. The cost of capital is quite high, and very often the perception of risk is exaggerated. So these are some of the findings that we've seen in the study. We are still very much on the matter of solidarity, to say that solidarity is crucial. If a continent is about 4% in terms of global emission, it's actually a continent that is in solidarity with the rest of the world. So that solidarity also, I think, needs to be met by other countries so that they can support Africa's priorities in terms of green industrialization, but in terms of also expanding its renewable energy potential. The finance commitment, I think, needs to be right. Those, as we've mentioned, and as we all know, is basically not where it needs to be. That elusive 100 billion that we are still talking about is actually way short of the needs that the continent has. We think that localization is an opportunity. So if we start looking at green industrialization, critical minerals, we need to begin production where it's closest. So we don't want to be a conveyor belt of goods, raw goods that are being exported out from the continent to other parts of the world, because that has been Africa's story since the colonial times. So we need to add value, and that adding value is important that it's done in a local context where it creates jobs. Job creation is very important. Local content is also very important. So these are all part of the local ownership and inclusive development that we're looking for. So I think I may have gone way beyond the time I was allocated, so I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima. That was a very comprehensive framing on behalf of the UN, the conveners of the event. I think you've made most important points here, but I just wanted to touch upon 4 of those that I think would be very important as we go into this discussion. One is that the scale of changes that are required are so massive that one is inclined to speak of a transformation rather than a transition. The point that market costs tend to be inflated while the social costs are deflated, so that policy gap. The context, which is very difficult with risk of stranded assets, but also the financial situation currently with the debt burden of a number of countries, and specifically in the context of Africa, the question of stranded assets. But then you have also spoken about opportunities, and I think these are also quite critical in terms of the critical minerals, the hydrogen economy, and the important point on localization and value addition. So thank you so much for that. I will now want to invite Minister Khattabi, Minister of Climate, the Environment, Sustainable Development and Green Deal of Belgium to address us. Minister, as you wish. C'est comme vous voulez. Vous voulez faire l'intervention d'ici?
Oui.
Alors, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. So it will be clearly another perspective, the same project, but another perspective. So big changes always begin within the confines of a few convinced people who dare the envision of a better world. From its inception under the visionary leadership of Tony Mazzocchi to this very moment, we can say the just transition has made its way to become a transformative force, which unites us today. A socially just ecological transition is not, if I may say it like that, a small revendication anymore. It needs to be at the heart of a new social contract. And at the heart of my commitment is the conviction that social and environmental justice are inextricably linked, and the necessary transition called for by the triple crisis we are experiencing must not be a double punishment for the most vulnerable among us. We know they are bearing the brunt of climate change and they would suffer the harmful effects of an unprepared, unthought transition. It's important not only not to leave no one behind, but to make this necessary transformation of our societies a lever in the fight against inequality and not just a strategy for making our economies greener. And in this regard, the much needed ecological transition represent the biggest social challenge of this century. I'm convinced that if we do not succeed in making the transition just for everyone, there will not be a transition at all. And at the same time, if we do not succeed in transforming our global system so that it operates within all planetary boundaries, we will fail all of those who come after us. We owe to ourselves to act with a view to creating a model that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. This is why we have resolutely opted for a just transition. Because both the costs and the opportunities must and can be shared fairly. Because time is short and energy is bound. Because so many sectors, such as cement, petrochemicals, and agriculture, need responses and public support that are equal to the challenges they face. Because for these sectors and many others, the cost of inaction will be much higher than the cost of transition. To govern is to foresee. Making our economies and societies sustainable whilst sharing the burdens and the gains of this transition in a fair way is the most important task for politicians today and for the next several decades to come. Before getting down to the political level, I found it crucial to first engage in dialogue with diverse stakeholders and learn from their insights, ideas, concerns, and recommendations. As the International Labour Organization guidelines indicate, when it comes to equitable transition, there is no one-size-fits-all. Policies and measures must be tailored to a country's specific circumstances. Defining those specific circumstances, risks, and opportunities is therefore exactly what we have achieved together, what we have achieved over the 2 past years. I worked towards the organization of a conference on a just transition in Belgium, in close collaboration with social partners, civil society, and public administrations. I wanted these essential stakeholders to exchange views, share their experiences, and learn from each, and especially to be heard by policymakers. Is it for that reason that I launched a public policy named the Estates General for a Just Transition in Belgium? It consists of 4 separate but linked work streams. The first one consists of the High Committee for a Just Transition. Meeting economic, social, and environmental challenges require governance based on the latest scientific findings. I appointed an interdisciplinary group of 22 academics specialized in social policy, economics, environmental sciences, and democratic innovation. Their work focused on the question how to organize and institutionalize the just transition in Belgium. After almost 2 years of intense work, they presented their reports and a set of policy recommendations a few weeks ago. The second work stream consists of a citizens' assembly. A just transition should take into account the daily realities of people and be especially attentive to the most vulnerable in our society. This citizens' assembly was composed of randomly appointed citizens representatives reflecting the diversity of our society. The participation of certain target groups, such as persons with physical disabilities or people living in poverty, was ensured. The citizens' assembly was tasked with answering the following questions. Under what conditions will the transition be just? Their recommendations must prevent blind spots for policymakers. Thirdly, it was important to prepare the Belgian state and its administration. An interdepartmental administrative working group brought together numerous administrations, from our health ministry to the Foreign Affairs Office, from our mobility administration to our social security experts, and many others. The experts of the different administrations presented the challenges in their perspective, fields, and competence to each other. They worked on laying bare possible synergies and trade-offs and described pathways to work together. And fourth, in line with ILO guidelines, it was essential for me to put social and civil society dialogue at the center of this process. Through a year-long process, we mobilized civil society actors from very diverse backgrounds. We could count on the participation of employers' organizations, trade unions, but also environmental NGOs and organizations working for the right of people with disabilities and people in poverty, and many others. Their work made it possible to identify 7 specific priority themes, around which 2 days of intensive roundtable discussions were organized. And the themes were employment, education, resources and energy, finance and investments, poverty eradication, gender equality, and international solidarity. Based on the results of this process, various advisory councils were asked to formally continue the work on the 7 priorities. This resulted in 7 comprehensive and rich opinions which will guide and inspire the work to be done in those fields. On the basis of all of the different inputs and recommendations gathered during this process, I am currently developing a blueprint with roadmaps, a just transition policy framework for Belgium. Besides, we obviously do not live in a vacuum in Belgium. We cannot respect planetary boundaries and meanwhile also guarantee a dignified existence for all on our own. We must also continue to build a fair and inclusive transition at the European level, but also international level. This is why we have chosen to make this just transition one of our priorities during our presidency of the European Union. If a 2022 Eurobarometer survey on perceptions of the green transition shows that only 50% of respondents think that the EU is doing enough to organize a just transition, this means that there is still work to be done. It will be up to us and the next European Commission to convince the remaining 50% of this as well. During our presidency, we will therefore put the just transition on the agenda at several informal and formal environment council, as well as organizing a 2-day European conference on just transition. Our aim is to work with the other member states and the European institutions to see what further steps we need to take within the European Union to ensure a just transition for all Europeans. In recognition of the central role that social dialogue and participation play, it was also crucial for me to work with the European civil society from the very outset of this journey. This is why the European Economic and Social Committee has been asked to draw up an opinion on the steps the EU should undertake to realize a more comprehensive just transition policy framework which can deliver on the 2050 objectives. And this document will serve a central role during the Belgian presidency. To conclude, allow me to underline how important it is that we are now working on a just transition working program in the context of the climate process. And I'm confident we will be able to lay the foundations for an effective program, one that supports countries in their efforts to ensure the essential link between the climate and social transition I mentioned at the start of my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for these words. And of course, this is very much clear in the context of the European Union and the steps that you are taking in Belgium. But I just want to echo some of the points that you have mentioned, the fact that just transition is a transformative force, and it can actually be a unifying force. I think there is divide in many areas of negotiations, but everyone understands that we have to be together to achieve a transition for all. And the fact that this is the social dimension of the transition is the biggest social challenge. And I think this is being understood much better in the UNFCCC process. And you have also illustrated the fact that just transition is not just about policy content, policy process is as much important. And that means social dialogue, but also what you have referred to as civil dialogue, engaging with all actors in society. And finally, the point that in making that just transition policy framework in Belgium, you are also engaging with non-executive sides of governance, which means that legislators and consultative bodies at national and regional level, like the European Economic and Social Committee, they all have a role to play. So this is a very broad framing, and I think these are also good ideas in terms of the discussions taking place on how to frame the Just Transition Work Program. So thank you so much, Minister, despite the very busy schedule for honoring us with your presence. So without further ado, I do not see Minister Chrissy, and I am not sure if there is any representative of the Minister in the room. If not, then I would turn to my dear colleague Jemima Juki, who is the Chief of Economic Empowerment at UN Women and also co-convener of this event. Jemima, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure for me to be here to join United Nations University and ILO and you, Minister, in this conversation. I would like to continue with that conversation that Professor Denton started when she said, justice for who? What justice and for who? And I want to talk about it from the perspective of women and girls, because that's our business as UN Women, gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. And we've been working with partners, including ILO, on how to ensure that the just transition is also just for women and girls. So we know that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. Women and girls are distinctly and often disproportionately affected by climate change, as it amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to their livelihoods, their health, and their safety. But we also know that a lot of jobs and decent work have been under threat from climate change, biodiversity loss, and climate-related conflicts and disasters. And this has put women at particular risk, given their overrepresentation, first in informal, low-wage, precarious work, but also their overrepresentation in the sectors that are really prone to climate change impacts, including agriculture. On the other hand, we see the just transition as an opportune moment to get things right, and especially for women and girls. Right now, ILO data confirms that more than 80% of the new jobs that are expected to be created primarily through the phase-out of coal mining and coal-fired power, will be in sectors currently dominated by men, including in the renewable energy sector and the mineral sector that Professor Denton so rightly talked about. But what we are also seeing is that we have an underrepresentation of women and girls in education in order to take advantage of those opportunities. Globally, just 18% of girls who are in tertiary education are pursuing STEM studies, compared to 35% of boys. What this means is young women and girls are not well positioned right now to access these jobs that will be created through a just transition. It is an opportune moment for us as we think about what a just transition looks like to really make sure that we are positioning the skills of women and girls to be part of that transition. So for the just transition to work, it needs to be truly equitable, it needs to be truly inclusive and fair. And all the actions that we take must take a human rights-based intersectional approach, must place social protection and care at the center. We heard that a lot of the financing right now from a lot of governments is going into debt repayments at the expense of programs like social protection. The Lima Program of Work on Gender and its Gender Action Plan that was adopted at COP25 notes that the implementation and means of implementation of climate policy and action, when it is gender responsive, that it can actually enable parties to raise their ambition towards a just transition, as well as enhance gender equality. So for us at UN Women, with the partners we work with, we recognize just transitions and achieving gender equality as interconnected and mutually reinforcing. We see gender responsive just transition as an essential pathway to achieve gender equality, and specifically in the world of work, while ensuring that it is gender responsive. It is fundamental to creating low-carbon, sustainable economies for the present and future generations. So ahead of COP, we launched what we called a gender-responsive just transition for people and planet paper and roadmap that recognizes 9 pathways for advancing gender equality and just transition. Today, in the interest of time, I'll just highlight a few of those pathways. The first is that we must systematically integrate gender equality considerations into just transition plans, and not just a mention of it, but really critical, concrete actions in the plans, in the policies, and the programs to support the resilience and adaptive capacities of women and girls, and potentially enable their participation and leadership in a just transition. Right now, we see we are very far from this goal. As of last year, 2022, only 10 of the 65 countries, or just 15%, that referenced just transition in their enhanced nationally determined contributions, NDCs, to deliver on the Paris Agreement actually linked this to gender equality. Second, we must significantly expand gender-responsive climate finance, and this includes increasing direct access to climate finance for women's grassroots and feminist organizations so that they can be part and parcel of the just transition. This will ensure that they have an entry point for effective implementation on the ground. The third is we must invest in the care economy for a gender-responsive just transition. Just transitions that prioritize investments in quality care jobs, services, and infrastructure also ensure that women are not left behind, and their disproportionate share of unpaid care work does not undermine their potential contributions to and benefit for a just transition. And after all, care jobs, such as those in the health, education, and long-term care sectors, are low-carbon jobs. Fourth, advance gender equality through sustainable energy transitions. With this sector estimated to nearly triple the amount of jobs by 2030, there is ripe opportunity for women to acquire the necessary skills, training, and education to access these newly created jobs, which are generally better paid and provide better benefits and security than jobs in sectors that are currently traditionally dominated by women. So as we think about the just transition, we must also think about what skills women and girls need to fully participate in that just transition, and to be part of it. And lastly, we need to close the data gaps to ensure accountability mechanisms are in place to monitor progress on our collective efforts towards a just transition. Because if it doesn't work for all, then it surely cannot be a just transition. So as UN Women, we always are on the ready to work with all of you to push efforts for a gender-responsive just transition. And I thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jemima, and I want to mention that we started the COP with this event on gender-responsive just transition with strong leadership from your side, UN Women. So this is highly appreciated, and I think what you have said about the fact that moving towards low-carbon economies will not by default bridge the gender disparities that they have in labor markets, so which means that dedicated policy interventions would be required to empower women and girls so that we have a gender-responsive and gender-equal labor market in the green economy. And the fact that the care economy is also critical, so that this transition from brown, if you like, to green can also link to the care economy that will also enable a stronger participation. So thank you so much for that and for being with us. We had in our program a representative from the International Trade Union Confederation. Ms. Alison Tate is unable to be with us. Mr. Roberto Suarez, the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers, had to leave Geneva, had to leave, where are we? Had to leave Dubai to Geneva yesterday, and apologies for that. And so I just wanted to take this moment to see if any representatives from okay. Yeah, any representatives from the IOE or International Trade Union Confederation, I think we have constituents in the room, to just come into the conversation now before we move to the second part of the panel. So any just input at this point? Anyone who wishes to take the floor from the side of trade unions? Otherwise, we can do this at the end of our session. Thank you, Minister. I understand you stay with us. Thank you. So with that, I will thank the Honorable Minister, Dr. Denton, and Dr. Chuki for this first round of presentation. And I would like to invite now, if they are in the room, I couldn't identify them, but we should have Ms. Maria Reyes. Is Ms. Maria Reyes in the room? Should be here for the Mexican Climate and Human Rights. And we should have Ms. Zainab Bie, Indian Climate Action Advocate. I don't see our two as expected speakers. So, which means that we will continue with the panel. So I would then have to call back Honorable Minister, Dr. Denton and Ms. Chuki, so that we get into the discussion, because that means more time for a change. So, alors, Madame la Ministre, alors moi je souhaiterais vous inviter de nouveau pour qu'on continue la discussion. So we would just go now immediately into a question and answer and an interactive exchange before I turn over to my dear colleague Osman for the closing. So this will leave us with about 20 minutes, dear colleagues, for discussion. And so please do introduce yourself and your institution when you take the floor. So I suggest that we make interventions no longer than 2 minutes. If you have questions, please just raise those questions. Otherwise, any input is also welcome, as this event is titled as Pathways and Lessons Learned Towards a Just Transition. We're also hoping to get ideas that could be useful for negotiators in the room here, working on the different just transition work streams. Sir? Okay, so I identify Madame in blue and Madame over here, and then the gentleman over, and Sir. So, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Gita, and I am a law student in the U.S. I was wondering, specifically in terms of the gender thread running through this. I rehearsed this question in my head, and now I lost it. Do you see a path towards mitigation that incorporates currently existing labor conditions and things like that for women, or is it forward-looking rather than, and like equality-focused versus mitigation-focused and with the side effect of gender equality?
Okay, thank you. I suggest we go for the first round of questions, and then we come back, Madame. Yes, Madame, here in the...
Thank you very much, and thank you all to all our speakers, because the interventions were really spot on. There is just one element that, according to me, is missing, because we keep on insisting on the fact that the so-called global north is still very much present in the so-called global south. I would like to argue that it also goes the other way around. Global south is very much present in our countries, in Europe, in our big cities, overrepresented in poverty rates. So the way in global south the transition will be designed has a direct impact on several fragilized minority groups in Europe. The ones responsible for the remittances, the ones who send monthly allowances to their families, and they are nowhere in the statistics, they're nowhere in the data that inform just transition pathways. So I would like to see if one of you has already had this epiphany that we need to collaborate in the design of those pathways, and which recommendations could be done for us Belgian delegation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Would you indicate which constituency?
My apologies. I'm Sima Majub from Belgium, from the Belgian Climate Center, and a researcher at the University of Brussels. And Minister Khattabi, I was one of the scientists in the High Committee for a Just Transition for Belgium.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So, gentleman of...
Hi, my name is Omar Farouk Osman. I'm the General Secretary of the Federation of Somali Trade Unions. Yes, I have seen the statistics, the information, but things are not gloom and doom as we may think, and we should always have a hope. Like in my country, Somalia, with all the problems we have got, we have made some inroads in terms of getting just transition. Very recently, we had a just transition enacted into law, the first time in Africa. We have just transition in our NDC. We have a just transition in our strategic plan. But then, when we come here, we are facing two challenges, which, participating in the negotiations on just transition working program that I see. Number one, how do we ensure inclusivity in the transition? And how do we protect the workers' rights? And it seems some are inclined even to dodge and avoid to protect the workers' rights. And to be honest with you, if we are all fighting for social justice, maybe it will be a trade union language, but there can be no social justice without climate justice. And there can be no climate justice without just transition. And there can be no just transition without workers' rights. So how do we confront this sort of misunderstanding of not addressing inclusivity in the transition and the protection of workers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are very important points. So there was the gentleman over here, and we do first round.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much to the speakers for fantastic insights. But I just want to kind of like maybe play a devil's advocate, so to speak, and ask the speakers if they think that the idea of the just transition is actually pie in the sky. And I say this because if you look at the Paris Agreement, the just transition is not even an article. It is one phrase, just transition, in the preamble. But it has dominated the space for so long, and therefore gives a signal that maybe it is a problem. So what do you think about the fact that if the just transition is only a phrase in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, but it has dominated this space for so long, does it make sense? Are we just wasting time talking about it? Because it shows that it is a big contentious issue, right? And therefore, if it's such a big contentious issue, are we ever going, as Professor Denton said in her framing, justice for who? Because there's as many answers as people you can think, or countries and so on. Therefore, do we really need to focus on the idea of the just transition, or what should we do about it? Why has it taken so much space, even though it was just a phrase in the preamble? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very important observation. So I would just turn over to the panelists. Just maybe pick, I think there was a specific question on gender, but otherwise, may I just go in the order we started?
Okay. Thank you very much, Mustafa. Let me start with the question that Linus, Dr. Morfo, provided. I think the challenge for us that is to really be so intentional about just transition. I really like what the minister said about almost the impossibility of a transition without justice. It's our baseline requirement. If we're going to get to a transition, justice needs to be at the center of what we're trying to arrive at. So we must be intentional, and we must also extract. I think for me, at least let me double take a bit. When we talk about just transition, I get a sense that we all have a sense of what are we talking about. And it's not the case, because it's a very relative term. And the danger that I see in response to the question that you ask is because the genealogy of just transition is not in some parts of the world, the framing wasn't done by some social groups and some sectors. So the framing has been done elsewhere. So the idea about how you recognize yourself in that framing is very important. Jemima mentioned it in terms of the gender-related justice. The minister talked about the efforts that they're doing in Belgium to really ensure that the social inclusive aspect is really in there. And I think that's where we should start. This transition is not about systems. In as much as it's about what monies can do, it's not also about monies, I have to say. It's really at the heart of the transition is people. And so we must really get people to own the transition. And by owning the transition, we must get their sense of what is the injustice that they see, and what is the agency that they have to rewrite some of those or unwrite some of those wrongs. So people have to be very central to the transition that we seek. If the transition is people neutral, if it's invisible where people are concerned, if it misrecognizes the harms that we're talking about, including the gender-related one that Jemima mentioned, then we would have to come back. And that coming back would be very costly. It would be costly in terms of governance systems. It would be costly in terms of infrastructure that we will have to put in place. It will be even costly in terms of intergenerational equity. So we can't afford to come back. what we need to do is to make sure that the lines are straightened in a way that allows us to get to the transition, that we are geared up for a transition that is relatively orderly, and that we're geared up also for the potential opportunities that are to be had in the transition. We cannot also focus too much on the wrongs of the past. I think I often say that the wrongs are there, the system is hardwired in injustice, but it is for us to pick out those injustices and then to be able to give agencies to the people who very often haven't got it, but to let them define their transition, let them define what it would take, let them define what they mean, you know, and how the current wrongs are hurting them in so many ways. So that's what I would say in response to that question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denton. Minister, to you.
Maybe two very short remarks. First of all, we are always talking about a just transition and that we have to pay attention on this transition. And it's, I hope you've heard also that from my side, that's, it's a priority. But I'm also convinced that it is in name of social justice that we have to go through the transition. Because if we speak about the just transition, in my personal point of view, I find that in the public debate, we do not enough denunciate the inequality of the effect of the crisis climate. And so it is in name of those inequalities that we have to go through the transition. So for me, there's no choice. Also, if we are only battling for equity, it is in name of this equity of justice social that we have to deal with the transition. That was my first general remark. And secondly, it was to answer to you. What I've heard seems to show that you are much more further than we are on just transition. So thank you for that, and I will be interested in hearing much more on what you have. But I'm also, to answer your question, I'm convinced that the just transition is also a question of climate governance. I think that we need to get away from the silo approach, and that the climate issue is just, if I may say it like that, an environmental issue. And to go out from this silo approach will also help us to take into account a certain number of effects of the transition. So I think that we're all managing our goals, we're all speaking about measure, procedures, mechanisms, and so on. But I think that at the heart of our climate governance, we have to change our paradigm, if I may, as policies. So I think it's urgent to go out from this silo approach if we want to tackle what you told us. Those was my two answers.
Thank you, Minister.
I think really agreeing with what you said about climate justice, social justice, and I would include economic justice, because by all accounts and purposes, what we've seen Fatima present is also about our economic systems and some of the inequalities that are inbuilt into them. And while sometimes it looks very insurmountable, I think we really must chip at it until we get to social justice, climate justice, economic systems that work for us. And us in the broadest sense, us in all our diversity. In terms of women's contribution to reductions in emissions, I think this week I've been very forward-looking in terms of where we need to go. At the same time, we really must recognize the women and girls in a lot of our communities, in a lot of our countries, at the global level, are driving climate action on a daily basis. They are driving some of the just transition pathways that we've talked about on a daily basis. They are working in renewables. Some of the most innovative projects and programs on renewable energy, on solar systems are driven by women. I'm reminded of some programs we have in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Tanzania, with some of our civil society partners, such as Solar Sisters, reaching 1.4 million people with solar technologies through about 10,000 women entrepreneurs who are at the forefront of developing these solar technologies and ensuring that they are available to their communities. So women every day are part of this process. What we want to be very deliberate and intentional about is that as we talk about just transitions, we're thinking about justice for women and girls. We're thinking about outcomes for women and girls and what we must do better now to make sure that that happens. Even in the renewable energy workforce, we still see a lot of women who are represented there. 32% of jobs in the renewable energy are held by women currently, at least as of 2021. But what is some of the injustice we see? Because of all the issues that I talked about, lack of enough support systems, stereotypes that are not encouraging or that are working against women in terms of their advancement in their careers or even their pursuit of educational opportunities. Only 23% of the managers in that sector are women. So we can't be 50% women in our populations, 32% in the workforce, 23% in the managers. I have a feeling only 1% of us are going to get to heaven at this rate. So we really need to make sure that we're doing better. We're better at ensuring that gender equality becomes part of the DNA that we apply when we do this work on climate and on just transitions.
Thank you very much, Jemima, for those very powerful words. So we have another time for another round of questions. So there's Madame here, and then the gentleman, then Madame, and then yes, so we can actually have 5. Then we will go. Yes, Madame, can I start with Madame in the front?
Hello, thank you so much for the interventions. I'm Shruti. I'm from New Delhi, India, and I represent an organization called Chintan. And our everyday work involves working with historically disadvantaged urban women who are essentially migrants because they've migrated to urban areas. And they're working within the waste and circular economy sector, and often minorities as well. So I think I have 2 specific questions, and I think it's open to the panel because it is gender-driven, but I'd be curious about responses. My first question is to do with, we spoke about people and pathways and the skills that need to be developed for women, or at least recognizing the skills that women need to develop when they get into the just transition pathway. But one of the things that we see constantly is that even if there are women who kind of get into, say, achieve economic equity, there's a lot of cultural barriers around it. They're also open to gender-based violence, especially from men, because there is competition, there's a lot of anger because they've kind of crossed certain boundaries or broken certain cultural norms. So how do organizations then recognize that? How do countries recognize that and have men as allies? My second question is out of curiosity, because we're talking a lot about gender, but what is the specific response that countries have had, or have you faced resistances from countries when you've said that let's take an intersectional approach? How do we convince countries that the intersectional approach is actually in service of all, and it's not just about, just women and particular women? So how do we convince them about that? So these are 2 questions I have.
Thank you very much.
And if someone has the answer, I'm also interested.
I think, there's Madame here and, gentleman behind first.
Thank you very much. My name is Benjamin, and I'm working with the World Blind Union. I'm also part of the Disability Caucus here at COP28. So first, I really would like to thank and congratulate Madame la Ministre for mentioning persons with disabilities, because we actually represent 16% of the population, the world population, but unfortunately, we are still missing in a lot of the actions, and also we don't have a lot of references in the document and actions that are led by the state parties and government in general. So we know that persons with disabilities also face a number of injustices and also at the heart of social inclusion. And my question was like, what steps, based also on the experience of Belgium, what steps can we take and member states can take to actually strengthen the engagement of persons with disabilities in the transition? Yeah, that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, well, first of all, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I'm Valeria, I'm from Spain, but I'm working as a researcher, doctoral researcher at Sciences Po Paris, so the Institute of Political Studies of Paris. And I think it was Professor Denton who said the phrase, or economic systems are not fit for purpose. And we also talked here about the need not only to transition, but rather to transform our systems. So I would like to know if you see in this green transition a space for creating more ambitious social and economic policies, more paradigm changing measures. So we hear a lot about degrowth in recent times. We hear a lot about sufficiency or sobriété, and also about using more ambitious progressive wealth taxes to finance climate action and other types of action. So I would like to know your views. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your valuable insights. I'm Tessa. I work at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin. I'm also a UNU alumni. And I have one question I would be very interested in. Specifically, Professor Denton, you touched up on it. What, in your view, are the most important lessons learned from the JETP process in South Africa, and especially in terms of justice considerations? Thank you.
Thank you. I see there was a last question, so we can just take the last one that will leave us time to answer.
Hello. Thank you for the really inspiring discussion. And I'm a researcher from New York University, Abu Dhabi, and I'm a representative of this university as well. And my kind of question, or what I'm willing to share, is kind of what's the role of new and emerging economics then, and kind of platforms in order to help kind of bridge the gap of green skills and labors and jobs. For example, gig economy and sharing economy, because this is kind of what I'm working on. And I see the potential of these kind of new ideas and platforms playing a role in kind of encouraging just transition and labor market reform. And another little concern is about how to, or what's the challenges of addressing kind of intersectional discrimination, because we're also concerned about the participation of youth. And we mentioned girls and women, but kind of they have their different needs and challenges in the face of just transition. So how can we kind of directly address these kind of intersectional layers coming out from individuals? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think these are all very relevant questions and comments. So may I turn over to panel members, Minister, Dr. Denton, anything you want to react to? But I just want to say the point on youth engagement is very critical, and we are actually in this last year at the COP, ILO, UNEP, and UNICEF launched a global pact on Green Jobs for Youth, where we engage with companies, LinkedIn, Iberdrola. The objective is to create 1 million green jobs by 2030 and to get those big companies, Iberdrola and others, to green and in their own operations to also green jobs for youth. So there is a lot of commitments we have from those partners. So this is really at the center of our agenda. And I like to say that we live in a world, of course, Jamima, women are 50%, but young people, if they are more than that. So this is a young people's world, and I'm very happy that you are all with us today. So would Minister?
It's not easy, because if I had the answer, I wouldn't be here. And honestly, the questions that you have are definitely at the heart of my own reflection. So we are now building, and so we are sharing with you our reflection. But I think that, well, we have a policy. I repeat it, I'm convinced that we have to go out from the silo approach, but very concrete examples is that we have, for example, to massively invest in training for new jobs. I'm also worried about the education that we still give in our universities. When we know where is the problem. It's an economic model. It's a model of growth, of extractivism and so on. And when you go to, when you see the economic causes, they are still dealing with the model that is responsible of the situation that we are facing. And so I think that the urgent matter is to put climate crisis in the center of all policies, also social policies. So that's, I think maybe, well, I'm sure it's not enough, but it's also not enough in my own eyes. That's why we are sharing experiences and that we build together this just transition.
Yeah, and Minister, if you allow me, I think that notion of intersectionality is also important, because we also see in this COP a number of ministries beyond climate and environment present. And I can mention that the US Department of Labor was for the first time joining a COP with the Deputy Undersecretary. So this is also a signal that governments realize this is a broad socio-economic agenda, and that is encouraging to see.
And also, if I may add, it was also the first time, I guess, that there was a health day.
Exactly.
Here. And so the health sector is also now joining us in our efforts to answer the climate crisis.
And Kiribati as well. We had the Minister of Labor of Kiribati at this COP. So we are 4 minutes ago. May I just give any last word before I turn to my colleague from the UN Economic Commission for Africa for closing? We have...
Thank you very much, Mustafa. It's a really pleasure to be here and listening to the really very rich debate. So I'm Nassim Ulman, the Acting Director of Technology, Climate Change and Natural Resource Management at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And we work on many of the issues that have been discussed. So really, we will continue the work, but from the African perspective. And all these issues on all your the debates and the questions resonate so really to specific challenges we are supporting the countries to face. So, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to attend and speak at this side event on the pathway and lessons learned leading to a just transition work program. It's very timely that we reflect the past and take actions for the future. I therefore commend ILO for bringing us together today so that when the world shifts to greener energy resources, there is a holistic approach to ensure that this transition is fair, inclusive, and beneficial for all, especially for Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, African countries face double challenges in the transition. On one hand, climate risks and disasters are threatening lives and livelihoods. Droughts, floods, cyclones, and plagues cause tremendous losses on the continent every year. 2 days ago, we had, again in Seychelles, impressive floods with the consequent costs for the country. So we need to scale up our efforts in climate mitigation and adaptation. On the other hand, unemployment is a serious socio-economic issue across our countries, coupled with fast increasing workforce, as well as gender and age divide within the workforce. If not addressed properly, our continent will pay a heavy, heavy human cost. With over 10 million young people entering the job market every year, and an economic structure depending predominantly in agriculture and in extractive industries, how can Africa embark a just transition pathway that is sensitive to these unique socio-economic dynamics? First, we must scale up investment in skill building and education tailored to the new energy economy, focusing on youth and women, who constitute a significant portion of the informal workforce. Education has been set as the theme for the 2024 by the African Union, and we shall take advantage of that to put just transition in the policies and priorities of education. Second, we must develop policies that encourage the diversification of economies, moving beyond agriculture and extractive industries, and create enabling environment for the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises in the renewable energy sector. These enterprises will be crucial in driving innovation and creating local job opportunities. Moreover, as the energy landscape is rapidly evolving, and our development strategies must be adaptive and forward-looking. Third, we must take gender lens and youth lens in policies and frameworks, including for social safety nets. Renewable energy sectors could provide tremendous employment opportunities to our countries, which present an opportunity to correct the long-standing gender and age divide in our labor market. Lastly, we must strengthen partnerships and country ownerships for just transition. In this regard, occasions like these are instrumental in building consensus for coordinated, concrete, and accessible actions. At the country level, the transition is not just a challenge for governments, but for society as a whole. Engaging diverse stakeholders, businesses, communities, academia, and international partners creates a shared vision and leverage collective expertise. This inclusive approach ensures that the transition benefits all, especially the most vulnerable. That's why, in our partnership with the government of the DRC and Zambia, and in collaboration with the Afrexim Bank, Africa Finance Corporation, Africa Development Bank, and the BADEA, to establish a special economic zone to leverage the African Free Trade Continental Area and Africa's abundant renewable energy and critical mineral resources, to develop a battery and electric vehicle regional and global value chains, we are phasing on inclusion. On inclusion to ensure that African citizens benefit really from the transformation of their natural resources, and that the innovation and entrepreneurship of African youth and women are nurtured to be integral to this process. So, ladies and gentlemen, just transition is not only a shift in energy sources, it's a transformative process that requires new ways of thinking and acting. It's about building a future that is sustainable, equitable, and prosperous. Let us embrace our past lessons and forge ahead with determination and hope so that no one is left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ullman, for this closing. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the end of the event, the pathways and lessons learned to a just transition work program. And I hope that we can continue the conversation as discussions are also taking place. And I want again to thank very much the Honorable Minister and distinguished panelists for spending the time with us in this session at this very important moment at the COP. So again, also for all of you for the time and the very interactive exchange we had, thank you very much, and we end our session here. Thank you. Yes, maybe, would you want to do that?
Sorry?